Hi class, this is the last video, the last chapter for your book, and we are going to be talking about research issues connected with social psychology. So we will start with just a background on what is research, the scientific method, experimental terms, and then we will go into a discussion of challenges that are connected with a lot of research in social psychology, like when you are using deception with people. So first, the scientific method. The scientific method has 4 steps that you should know. The first one is observation. You observe what is going on. The next step is making a guess as to why this thing is happening. The third step is framing that guess as a testable hypothesis, something that you can actually perform research on. And then finally, the last step is to design an experiment or potentially a series of experiments to test your hypothesis and see if you were accurate in what you thought was going on. So when you do an experiment, which is what a lot of the research that you learned about this semester was about, you have an independent variable and you have a dependent variable. The independent variable is the variable an experimenter changes or varies to see if it has an effect on some other variable. That other variable it would have an effect on is the dependent variable. It's what you measure to assess the effects of the independent variable. The easiest way to know the difference between an independent and a dependent variable, if you are trying to see which one is in an experiment, like if it is a test question. For example, one experiment that you learned about this semester, let me think of one. So for example, from chapter 8, does self-esteem have an effect on who you're attracted to? Because remember, chapter 8, if you have low self-esteem, you are more likely to hit on someone who's less attractive rather than someone who's very attractive because you don't want to get shot down again. So does self-esteem have an effect on who you're attracted to? So for this, the first part of it, if you put your research question in that format, does blank have an effect on blank? The first thing, the initial thing, is the independent variable. So the independent variable is going to be self-esteem. And does self-esteem have an effect on who you're attracted to? So the dependent variable, the thing that is dead last, is the who you're attracted to. You can also just reason through this. The independent variable, you are always in charge of. You get to decide what it is. You get to decide whether a participant gets it or not, or what level of it they get. So for example, in this experiment, you decide, in that case, they manipulated them with false test scores. You decide if someone has high self-esteem or low self-esteem for this experiment. So you get total control over an independent variable. And the dependent variable, you don't get to control. You don't get to decide who they are attracted to. But for the dependent variable, it's what you measure at the end of your study. The dependent variable is always what you measure at the end. And so at the end, what you're measuring, what you're looking at is who did they hit on? Was it the attractive looking woman or was it the unattractive looking woman? That's the dependent variable. So that every experiment you have to have that independent and dependent variable. The next thing to go over is random assignment. Random assignment is when each participant has an equal chance of being in any condition of the study. So, for example, in that experiment, you are randomly deciding which guys get high self-esteem or low self-esteem. You're not cherry picking who is in each group. It's random assignments. So you are randomly giving people positive test scores or negative ones to manipulate their self-esteem. The reason you have to do this is to control for extra variables. If you do not have random assignment, then there's a chance that there's another variable that could affect your results. So for example, in that experiment, the reason they gave them false test scores to raise or lower their self-esteem versus going out and finding people who already had high self-esteem or low self-esteem. So the participants didn't have an equal chance of being in either group. They found people who already fit that group. Maybe there's something that contributes to what your self-esteem generally is that also contributes to who you're going to hit on, and it's not just the self-esteem that has an effect. You don't know that for sure. You have to control who gets the independent variable. You have to control what level of it they get, and you have to randomly assign people to those groups so that you can make sure it's not other random variables that are having an effect, what we call confounding variables. And so that is why if you are not able to do that, like if you just do a correlation, I found people with low self-esteem, hey, look, this is who they tend to date, you cannot assume causation. You can't say it's the self-esteem that caused this. You have to do an experiment. You have to control who gets that independent variable. You have to randomly assign people to it in order to say, yes, this thing is what caused that thing. So keep that in mind. So a couple of challenges with experimentation. These especially apply to social psychology, but more than that as well. Other forms of psychology can potentially have these issues. It's just that social psychology, for example, if you think about Milgram's obedience study, if you think about Zimbardo's prison study, there have definitely been some studies that are just a wee bit unethical, tend to be in social psychology. One thing you have to think about is control versus impact. So how much control you have over how much impact you can have on the participants. Control is limited by the fact that people differ from one another in a bunch of different subtle ways. And an experiment has to have an impact on the participants. They have to take the experiment seriously and become involved in it. So that it will actually affect their behavior in a meaningful way. The problem is, the more control you have over an experiment, the more you get to decide exactly what's happening to the participants, the less real it's going to feel, and so the less impact you're going to have. There's a negative correlation between control and impact. The more you're trying to make sure everything's set up perfectly, the more the participants are going to feel that it's a little fake, and so the less impact it's going to have on them. And this connects with realism. If an experiment has an impact on a participant, it really forces them to take it seriously and involves them in the procedures. When this happens, we say you have experimental realism. And in the lab experiment, if it's similar to events that frequently happen to people in the outside world, then we say you have mundane realism. So in an experiment, you really want to have both the mundane realism as well as the experimental realism. That's when you're going to get the most realistic results, the ones that can actually be applied to the real world. But it can be tricky. So for example, in Milgram's study, one complaint was, like, they were doing this experiment at Yale. They're in the psychology department at Yale. They know a Yale psychologist is not going to force them to kill somebody. It's Yale. And so you have to, that's a little less mundane realism. So for example, Milgram did not do the study, but another experiment that was done connected with this to try to add that mundane realism. They called nurses who worked at a hospital and said, hey, and all the nurses at these hospitals had been told, there's a new psychiatrist on staff called Dr. Smith. They hadn't met him yet, but they knew there was a new psychiatrist. So all these nurses would get a phone call, and the person would say, hi, this is Dr. Smith. I have to see a patient, Mr. Jones, soon, and I want him to have had some medicine and have it start taking effect before I see him. Can you go to the medicine cabinet and see if you have any Astrotin? And so they'd go and look for the Astrotin, and it'd be there. It'd be a drug they hadn't heard of, and really big on the bottle, it would say daily maximum dose, 10 milligrams. So they'd go back to the phone and say, yes, I have the Astrotin. And the doctor, Dr. Smith, would say, please give Mr. Jones 20 milligrams. I'll be down in 10 minutes to sign the paperwork. Because all of these hospitals had a procedure where a nurse was not allowed to give medicine without a written form signed by a doctor. So this is a doctor they'd never met, asking them to give twice the daily allowable dose of a medicine they'd never heard of to a man without having that signed form in hand. 95% of the nurses gave the medicine. This is obedience. This is, in a real world experiment, potentially killing someone because someone with authority over you told you to. Because all these nurses, when asked, like, why did you give the medicine, said, you know what doctors do if you say no to them. Like, doctors are over the nurses in these hospitals. And so if you can set up an experiment in such a way as to have both of those forms of realism, the experimental realism and the mundane realism, it's more likely you can then apply it to other things. Another potential challenge in experiments in psychology is deception. Because participants are always trying to figure out what's going on, or if they know what your hypothesis is, what you're trying to do, they might try to behave in a way that helps you get your results. Sometimes you have to lie to them. You don't want the participants' expectations or assumptions about the experiment to affect your results. You want it to be like the real world. And so sometimes you have to have a cover story. So the cover story is when you don't tell the participants what's really happening. You do this to increase that experimental realism by producing a situation where the participants can act naturally without being inhibited by knowing what exactly you're studying, what about their behavior you're actually measuring. And so examples of this, like with that medicine study at the hospitals with the nurses, they didn't know they were participants. The cover story was, here's this new doctor. Aronson's study on the looking at self-justification with the women who thought they were joining a group about the psychology of sex, and then they had to say really vulgar things or not vulgar things, and who wanted to be in the group afterwards. That was the cover story. Do you want to join this group? Ash's line study is another example of a cover story where it's, we're measuring perception. Because if participants came in and you said, we're measuring conformity, that's going to affect their behavior. So most of the studies you learned about this semester have deception, have a cover story involved. That attraction study with the self-esteem, they didn't know it was a study on attraction. They thought they were participants testing an intelligence test. And then, hey, let's go get coffee. That they did not know what the real study was about. So oftentimes you're going to use deception. There are some ethical problems connected with this, though. One, it's unethical to lie to people. Two, deception leads to an invasion of privacy. And three, experimental procedures often entail some unpleasant experiences. So let's go through these. It's unethical to lie to people is easy to understand. You're not supposed to lie to people if you don't have to. And why this is unethical, especially in research, is that when you participate in an experiment, before you start, you sign an informed consent saying, I understand, here's what's going to happen. I understand what's going to happen. Yes, I agree to participate in the study. If you're lying to them about what the study is, you cannot get legitimate informed consent. Those guys were not saying, yes, you can observe how I hit on a woman. That's not what they were consenting to. And so if you are lying to them, you are not allowing your participants to give you legitimate informed consent. And then if you are lying to them and then making them go through something uncomfortable, unpleasant, that they didn't agree to, that is unethical. That if they didn't agree to undergo something unpleasant, it's unethical to make them go through that. For example, Milgram's experiment, they didn't agree to go through the psychological trauma of thinking they were hurting someone. They agreed to help study learning and operant conditioning. And so to force them to go through this uncomfortable thing that they didn't agree to is not ethical. There's this struggle in doing experiments, doing psychological research, especially ones that have deception. And that is, you have these two conflicting values. You have the belief in the value of scientific inquiry. It's important to do this research. It's important to learn these different facts. But you believe in the dignity of people, in their right to privacy, in their right to have a say in what happens to them. And so you have to find a balance between these two things. In general, experiments that have deception can be concerning because with that lying, you are taking away some of their dignity as humans in order to get at that scientific inquiry. And so you have to do what Aronson says is basically a cost-benefit analysis. Is the good you're going to get from this research more than the harm you are potentially doing to your participants? And let's be honest, a lot of times researchers aren't so awesome at deciding that for themselves. And so that's a huge reason why you have IRBs in schools for people who are going to be doing research. You have to have your research approved by this institutional review board, and basically they figure this out. If you are lying, is it justified? Is there a way to get at your research without the deception? If you are deceiving people, do you have a debriefing that makes it clear what you were actually studying? Do you have a way to take out the data from a participant who, after they know what the real reason for the research is, doesn't want their information used? Are you not harming them so much it's not worth what you are going to learn? And so that's why a debrief is so important. That's where the purpose of the study, exactly what happened, is explained to participants at the end of the experiment. And especially if there's deception, there's a mechanism where they can say, no, what you learned from me, you cannot use in your research. I didn't want to be a part of this, and they can be removed. And so this struggle between harming the participants and what you're learning, one example of this in my own research is in Rwanda. So most of my research has been in Rwanda with genocide survivors. And so going through the IRB process for my research was always very time consuming, very difficult, because genocide survivors are a unique group. You really have to be careful that you are not doing more harm to people who have already been through a very traumatic thing in their lives. And so for my research, for one study I did, going through that scientific method process, during one of my trips to Rwanda, I was going to meetings in a rural area with genocide survivors, and they would be talking, and I noticed that they were talking about the descendants of Cain, and this was interesting to me. There is a racist idea connected to Rwanda about the origins of the groups in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis. It's called the Hamitic myth. You don't need to know a lot about it, but basically it has to do with the story of Noah and the flood that came, and after the flood that killed everyone on earth except for Noah and his family, Noah got drunk and his son saw him drunk and naked, and one of his sons laughed at him, Ham. And so Ham was banished. And so there's this racist theory, old theory, that Africans are the descendants of Ham. And so that's why they're black and not white, is it's part of their curse. Lovely little racist myth. And it helped justify enslaving people because, hey, look, God cursed them a long time ago. And so a variation of that myth was in Rwanda, talking about the differences in appearance between Hutus and Tutsis and why Westerners favored Tutsis. Anyways, so the survivors that I was meeting with had basically adapted that myth and added in the fable of Cain and Abel, where Cain killed his brother Abel and was banished. And so the survivors were basically saying, we are descendants of Abel. The Hutu who tried to kill us are descendants of Cain. And this was a fascinating idea to me. And as someone who studies social psychology and social identity, I started to think, I wonder if survivors who see Hutus, especially Hutu bystanders, people who did not try to kill them in the genocide, but who also did not help them, if they see them as more different, like we're from Abel, you're from Cain, if that affected how much they were able to forgive. If there was a relationship between these inclusive social identities, we're all one, or exclusive social identities, we are very different people, whether that had a relationship with unforgiveness levels, how much they still had avoidance, revenge, how little benevolence they had towards this other group. And so I did a correlational study looking at people's social identities, survivors' social identities, and their unforgiveness levels towards bystanders. And there was a significant negative correlation between the inclusive identities and unforgiveness levels. So the more inclusive their social identities were, the more they saw themselves as in the same group with bystanders, the less unforgiveness that they had, the less they were avoiding these people, the less they wanted revenge against these people, the more they felt good, benevolent thoughts about these people. And so my next, because remember, scientific method, oftentimes it can be multiple research projects you're doing. My next thing was going to be an experiment, because all I'd done was a correlation. I knew there was this relationship. Did the social identity change cause the unforgiveness change, or was it the unforgiveness that caused a change in social identity? So I was going to go to Rwanda and manipulate people's social identities, get them to have more inclusive ones, and then see how that had an effect on their unforgiveness levels. And so for this, hey, come on, stop. Sorry, my dog is scratching my chair. So for this question for you, if my research question was, does social identity have an effect on unforgiveness? What is my independent variable and what is my dependent variable? So my independent variable, social identity levels, dependent variable, what I'm measuring at the end, unforgiveness levels. So before I came back, when I was still in Rwanda on a previous trip, I was thinking about this, saying, hey, this is what I think I'm going to study. I was having a talk with two of my friends who were both genocide survivors, and they were really unhappy with me. So this is a conversation we had. One of them, H, said, we trusted them in 59. This person was talking about the Hutus. We trusted them in 62 because in 1959 and 1962, there were what they call mini genocides against the Tutsi. We kept trusting them and they kept killing, and then they had the final extermination. How can we trust them now? We can work with them, live near them. I can have you next to me in the office. I can eat next to you. I can see you and say hi and hi, but I cannot trust you. Understand? There are Hutus that are ashamed to be Hutu. They say, I wish I was not Hutu because of what the Hutus did. And Jay said, you know, she's a widow, talking about H. They killed her husband and they left her with no children, no family. She's all alone, and you want her to trust them and feel safe around them. And then H says, of course we have security in the country. The government is protecting us. There will not be another genocide, but we do not trust those Interahamwe. The Interahamwe are the militia group that did the killings, and so they're grouping all Hutu into the Interahamwe. I was part of the research team, and we spoke to prisoners, and you know what they said? Things like, if the police turn away and are not looking, we will keep killing those Tutsis. How can I trust those Hutus when they say that? We trusted them, and they killed us. I've forgiven, of course. I will live near them and work with them, but I don't trust them. How can you ask me to trust? If you're living in a community and it was all Taliban, this conversation took place in 2003? 2004, so really soon after September 11th. Would you feel safe? Would you trust the people around you? That is what it is for the survivors. They must see the killers. They are just on the street. They must live with them, but they do not trust them. It's only been 10 years. Oh, wait, so this was 2004. After all that we did, can we trust them? So they were very upset at this idea that I was going to come in and do this experiment to manipulate people's social identity to get them to forgive. Because she had said, we forgive, but this is a sign that there was not true forgiveness, decrease in revenge thinking, increase in benevolence. So I talked to a couple other people after this to see if this was really the common idea around the survivors that I knew, and it was. And so if I did this experiment, I was going to have to use deception. I couldn't tell my participants, I'm trying to get you to like these Hutu bystanders more. And so I realized at this point, this was too soon after the genocide, the survivors I worked with were ones that had experienced harsher things in the genocide and had a more difficult life post-genocide than some survivors. And so I realized it wasn't ethical for me to come in and try to force this on them, to lie about it to get them to forgive. At this point, it would have been too traumatic for them. The benefit of that scientific inquiry wasn't enough to overcome the psychological trauma that could occur if they weren't able to forgive or trying to force them to forgive before they were ready. And so I didn't do that experiment then. I actually changed my research and studied how the government and society was trying to change the history of the country to promote inclusive social identities rather than trying to actually manipulate them myself. But even though it would have been really interesting research, it's not just about what's interesting to the researcher. You also have to think about your participants, especially if you're using a more vulnerable group like genocide survivors. So that is it for this chapter. That's it for the video.